The CERN's call for help was simple, but its implications were anything but. The message echoed across the vast emptiness of space. We are dying. The Krons come. Please, send aid. It was sent with a sense of desperation, a plea from a species on the brink of extinction. Though the CERN were known for their technological prowess in energy manipulation, their physical frailty left them vulnerable to the Krons' brutal, warlike nature. The insectoid invaders had swept across countless worlds, leaving nothing but scorched earth in their wake. The galaxy, however, was not as united as it once seemed. For millennia, the different species of the galaxy had lived with their own interests at heart. The CERN were not a major galactic power. They were an isolated species, their homeworld tucked away in a peaceful waterlogged system. Other, more advanced races, including the Zorethians, a hyper-intelligent species of telepaths, and the Terran-based Talcor, a cold-blooded warrior race, saw no benefit in helping the CERN. The Zorethians found the CERN's way of life too primitive for their tastes, while the Talcor saw no challenge in subduing them. To them, the Krons' war on the CERN was a power struggle they had no desire to intervene in. But on Earth, things were different. News of the CERN's plea had reached the United Earth government not as a matter of diplomacy or galactic interest, but as a matter of survival. The world had seen its fair share of wars, ranging from ancient conflicts to near-total destruction during humanity's early space exploration days. But in each of those battles, humanity had faced seemingly insurmountable odds, yet had prevailed. It was this unpredictable resilience that had earned Earth a certain reputation across the stars, despite its relatively young place in the galactic community. General Jack Reynolds paced in the war room, deep in thought. He had fought in Earth's most recent conflicts, the resource wars that had nearly torn the planet apart, and had seen firsthand what humanity was capable of when pushed to the brink. But even he wasn't sure what to make of the message. The CERN, as peaceful and intelligent as they were, had no military strength to speak of. And the Krons, they were a terrifying force, feared across the galaxy for their ruthless conquests and superior technology. Reynolds wasn't a man who made decisions lightly, especially ones that could cost countless lives. But his gut told him that this wasn't just a matter of an innocent species facing a stronger foe. The Krons weren't the type to stop at the CERN. They had their sights set on the whole galaxy, and if humanity didn't respond, they would soon find themselves facing the same fate. Turning to his tactical staff, Reynolds addressed the room. "We're not going to let them fall without a fight. We'll send a fleet. We'll give them a fighting chance, and we'll do what we do best: adapt, outthink, and survive." Admiral Lydia Foster, who had joined the meeting in a show of solidarity, nodded. "If we can stall the Krons long enough, we can turn the tide. The CERN may not have soldiers, but they have technology we can use. We'll need everything we've got." The room fell silent, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. The United Earth government hadn't agreed on much in recent years, but on this, there was no debate. Reynolds made the call. Earth was going to help. They would answer the CERN's call. The fate of two worlds now rested on their shoulders. As General Reynolds's orders were passed through the military channels, a wave of skepticism rippled through Earth's leadership. The United Earth government had grown fractured in the wake of a series of internal conflicts. Regional tensions, resource shortages, and ideological divides had all left their mark. In many ways, humanity had struggled to rebuild after decades of division. Now, with the CERN's plea for help, the call to act was immediate, but so was the pressure to think carefully. At the government's headquarters in Geneva, a special session was convened. Chancellor Julia Carter, the head of Earth's Leadership Council, opened the meeting, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The council chamber was divided into factions, each representing a different region or interest of Earth: military advisors, political representatives, and economic experts, all with their own agendas. The atmosphere was tense, the stakes higher than they had been in years. "We cannot afford to act impulsively," Chancellor Carter said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of the room's concerns. This is not just about saving one species, it's about the future of Earth. We've barely recovered from our own wars. Are we ready to take on a force as powerful as the Krons? One of the senior political advisors, Senator Thomas Crane, stood up, shaking his head. We don't even know if the Krons will come after us. The Xern are a small, insignificant species. Their war is theirs to fight. Helping them is a waste of resources we cannot spare. If we get involved, we risk drawing the Krons' wrath upon us. And for what? Admiral Lydia Foster, who had been quietly listening, cut through the conversation. We know what the Krons are capable of, Senator. They don't just conquer, they exterminate. If we wait until they're at our doorstep, it will be too late to prepare. We're not talking about saving a species. We're talking about survival. Foster's words hung in the air, but the Council was far from convinced. Earth's resources were stretched thin after years of rebuilding, and many felt the costs of intervention might outweigh any potential gain. There was no guarantee the Krons would target Earth, no certainty that humanity's involvement would make a difference. General Reynolds is making a mistake, Senator Crane pressed. This is a gamble, and a dangerous one. But as the debate raged on, an unexpected voice entered the room. Dr. Emily Carter, a renowned scientist and an advisor on advanced technology, had remained silent until now. With a calm that belied the gravity of the situation, she addressed the Council. We're not just talking about military intervention. The Xern have technology, energy manipulation, that we've barely begun to understand. They're weak in terms of military power, but their technology could give us a significant advantage. Not only could we help them, but in doing so, we might gain access to knowledge that could change the course of humanity's place in the galaxy. Her words brought a shift in the mood. While the Council members had been focused on the risks, Dr. Carter pointed out a potential benefit, one that sparked curiosity in some of the more scientifically minded members. Earth could gain insight into alien technology, and this knowledge could have far-reaching consequences. Chancellor Carter stood, gathering her thoughts. We cannot afford to ignore what's at stake. General Reynolds will lead the mission, with the understanding that we're acting in the interest of all humanity. We will help the Xern, but we'll do so with caution. This will be a joint military and scientific effort. The decision was made. The Earth fleet, under General Reynolds' command, would deploy to the Xern system. But doubts remained, questions that even the most optimistic members of the Council couldn't shake. Would humanity's resolve be enough to face the Krons, or would they find themselves caught in a war they weren't prepared to fight? As the meeting adjourned, the future of both Earth and the Xern rested on a single choice. The journey to the Xern system was swift, but the tension aboard the Courage was palpable. General Jack Reynolds stood on the bridge, staring out at the vast expanse of space. The hum of the ship's engines was a constant reminder of the mission they were on, a mission that had taken Earth to the brink of a war they weren't sure they could win. The crew was seasoned, but even seasoned warriors couldn't ignore the weight of what lay ahead. Admiral Lydia Foster stood beside him, her posture as rigid as ever. We're approaching Xern Prime, General. The Xern have already begun evacuating some of their coastal cities. They're bracing for the worst. Reynolds nodded, his face grim. The Xern homeworld, a water-rich planet teeming with life, was breathtaking from orbit. From a distance, it looked like a paradise. Blue oceans, white-capped waves, vast stretches of green land that promised peace. But the reality was far from serene. The Krons had already begun their assault, and the tranquil beauty of the planet was now marred by the looming threat of destruction. The Krons won't stop until they've crushed everything here, Reynolds muttered, his mind racing. He knew the enemy. He knew their ruthlessness. They were a force of nature, methodical and cold, capable of wiping out entire species with little more than a thought. And the Xern, fragile, vulnerable, were standing in the way of their expansion. Captain Foster, we need to make contact with the Xern leaders immediately, Reynolds ordered. The sooner we establish a strategy, the better. A few hours later, the Courage descended into CERN's atmosphere, approaching one of the last remaining cities not yet overrun by the Krons. The CERN's capital city, Irisis, was located on the largest of their islands. As the ship touched down, a sleek shuttle was prepared to carry Reynolds, Foster, and a small team to meet the CERN leadership. When the shuttle doors opened, they were met with an overwhelming sight. CERN leaders, small in stature and lithe in their movements, stood waiting. Their blue-green skin shimmered under the sun's light, and their large, multifaceted eyes gave them an almost otherworldly presence. The leader who stepped forward, her eyes filled with both gratitude and despair, was Kessa, the CERN High Counselor. "General Reynolds, Admiral Foster, welcome to CERN Prime," Kessa said, her voice a blend of hope and sorrow. "We did not expect Earth to come to our aid, but we have no other choice." Reynolds extended his hand in greeting, his gaze unwavering. "You've been brave in the face of this war, Counselor, but now we need to make sure we can give you the means to fight back." Kessa nodded, a slight tremor running through her. "The Krons, they have devastated our colonies. They understand our energy manipulation technology, but they are too powerful. We do not have the resources to fight them on our own." Reynolds glanced around at the city. The towering buildings, the intricate canals that ran through the streets, they were beautiful, but they were also vulnerable. The Krons would exploit every weakness. "We'll help, but you'll need to give us everything you have, every bit of knowledge. We can't defeat them if we don't understand your technology." Dr. Emily Carter, who had joined the team as the lead scientist, stepped forward. "The CERN's energy manipulation technology could be a game changer, but we need access to it. How can we adapt it for use against the Krons?" Kessa turned to lead them into a nearby facility. "I'll show you what we have, but it may not be enough. The Krons have more resources than we can fathom. They've already taken our most valuable energy reserves and weaponry." As they walked, Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The Krons' forces were already closing in on CERN Prime's northern regions. If they didn't act quickly, this world, this beautiful, fragile world, would fall. "The Krons are coming, and they'll stop at nothing to wipe us out," Kessa said, her voice now filled with an edge of desperation. "If we cannot fight them, then we'll die together." Reynolds clenched his fists. "That's not going to happen. Not while we're still standing." And as they entered the heart of the CERN's technological vault, he knew they had to prepare for what would come next, a fight unlike anything humanity had ever faced before. The Krons were relentless, but so was humanity, and they were about to show the galaxy what it meant to stand together in the face of extinction. The air was thick with tension as General Reynolds, Admiral Foster, and their small strike team stood alongside the CERN warriors in the command center of their last remaining stronghold. The hum of the Courage's engines reverberated in their bones as the warship hovered above the coastline. In the distance, the first signs of the Krons' approach were unmistakable. Dark silhouettes of enemy ships filled the sky, blocking out the sun like a living storm. Below, CERN cities had already begun to fall under bombardment, and the distant echoes of destruction sounded like a warning shot to those who still resisted. "General, the Krons are within range," Admiral Foster said, her voice tight with focus. "They'll be in strike range in less than an hour. We need to act fast." Reynolds nodded grimly. This wasn't the first time he had faced overwhelming odds, but every battle had its own unique weight. The CERN were not soldiers. They were survivors, their strengths in their intellect, not their combat prowess. The Krons, on the other hand, were brutal and efficient, a species forged by endless warfare. If they got too close to the planet's surface, it would be a massacre. "Prepare the CERN's energy weapons," Reynolds said to Dr. Emily Carter, who was overseeing the operation to modify their technology. The CERN had gifted humanity access to their energy-based weaponry, hoping to turn the tide, but it had yet to be adapted to human combat styles. Dr. Carter, ever the pragmatist, adjusted a set of controls on her tablet. We can channel the CERN's energy cores into our weapons, but they're not designed to fire at the same scale the Krons are used to. We'll need to be precise. Too much power, and we'll blow a hole in the planet." "Understood," Reynolds said, his gaze scanning the horizon. "We'll make it count." With minutes to spare, the Krons launched their first wave, fast-moving assault ships that began raining fire upon the CERN stronghold. The ground trembled as explosions rocked the surface, and the sky grew darker as the Krons' warships released their full payload. The Krons were methodical, sending in their bombers first to weaken the defenses before sending in their full assault force. "Deploy the countermeasures," Reynolds barked, stepping forward into the fray. His team, now joined by a handful of CERN soldiers, activated a series of energy shields designed to hold back the Krons' bombardment. Meanwhile, CERN ground troops, equipped with modified weapons and shields, advanced into position, ready to hold the line. The first Krons to land were towering, insectoid soldiers, their chitinous armor glinting in the artificial light of the city. They moved with terrifying efficiency, overwhelming the CERN positions with their sheer size and firepower. As they marched toward the city's inner sanctum, Reynolds and his team engaged with a series of guerrilla tactics they had refined aboard the Courage. Reynolds led a small team of human soldiers forward, using the CERN's modified energy weapons in combination with human precision. As they approached the Krons' front line, they encountered the first of many challenges. Krons armed with devastating plasma cannons, capable of turning even the strongest defensive lines to ash in seconds. The humans, however, weren't outmatched. They adapted quickly, using the CERN's energy shields in combination with hit-and-run tactics, disrupting the Krons' formations with blinding bursts of fire. "Hold the line," Reynolds shouted over the comms, his voice firm but commanding. The Krons, momentarily disoriented, began to regroup. But the humans weren't done yet. Dr. Carter, working from the command center, linked into the CERN's energy systems, rapidly recalibrating their weapons for a more focused attack. "I've got it," she said, her voice steady. "Now, General, fire at will." With a synchronized blast, the newly adapted weapons unleashed their full potential. Streams of concentrated energy shot out, striking the Krons' forces with explosive force. The insectoid warriors recoiled, their shields buckling under the impact. For the first time since the battle had begun, the Krons seemed unsure of themselves. The humans' unpredictable tactics, combined with the CERN's technology, had made them realize something important. They were not the only ones capable of warfare. The ground was littered with the wreckage of Kron ships, and the CERN began to push forward, gaining ground. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a moment of hope, a spark that could turn the tide if they acted quickly. "Keep pushing," Reynolds urged. "We've slowed them down, but this isn't over. We fight until the last ship falls." As the battle raged on, the Krons' retreat turned into a desperate counterattack, proving to both sides that the true nature of this war had just begun. The Krons were not accustomed to being outsmarted, and humanity had just shown them how costly underestimating Earth could be. But as Reynolds and his team continued the fight, they knew one thing for certain. The true challenge was still ahead, and the Krons were not going to back down easily. The battle on the surface of CERN Prime had shifted in humanity's favor for the moment, but General Reynolds knew it was only temporary. The Krons were relentless, and the respite they'd gained through the initial strike would not last long. He surveyed the battlefield from the command center of the Courage, watching the ongoing chaos as CERN forces and Earth's soldiers continued to push the Krons back. But the Krons were a different breed of enemy. Every retreat they made only led to a fiercer counterattack, and their numbers seemed endless. "General, we've detected a large fleet coming out of hyperspace," Admiral Foster reported from her station. "It's the main Krons armada. They're preparing to encircle the planet." Reynolds clenched his jaw. "How long until they're in range?" 30 minutes at most," Foster replied, her voice sharp with urgency. "We can hold the line on the ground, But we need to rethink our strategy if we're going to keep them from overwhelming us. The first wave of Krons had been defeated, but there was no hiding the truth. Their fleet was far too large for even Earth's combined forces to repel in a straight-up confrontation. The Turn had given humanity their weapons, but they still lacked the firepower to defeat a full-scale invasion. "We need to buy ourselves time," Reynolds said, his mind working through the options. "If we can prevent the Krons from establishing a planetary blockade, we might just have a shot." Dr. Emily Carter, standing near the tactical display, looked up. "The CERN's energy cores can be weaponized in ways that we haven't fully explored. There's a chance we could overload their central reactor, causing a catastrophic chain reaction. That would take out the Krons' fleet and their main forces, but we need to get to the energy facilities before they do." Reynolds nodded. "Get the coordinates. We're going after their central reactor." Foster stepped forward. "We don't know the full extent of what we're dealing with, General. A reactor meltdown of that scale could decimate the entire system." "We have no choice," Reynolds said, his voice unwavering. "The Krons will destroy the CERN, and after that, they'll turn their attention to Earth. If we don't act now, we'll be next." The Courage's engines roared to life as the fleet prepared to launch a daring raid on the CERN's central energy facility. Reynolds knew that this was their best, and possibly only, chance to cripple the Krons before they could fully mobilize. The team assembled once more, this time including several CERN soldiers who had volunteered to join the operation. Their crystalline energy shields and intimate knowledge of the terrain would be invaluable in navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the energy plant. Dr. Carter was at the front, her hands flying over her tablet as she accessed the CERN systems, guiding the team through their final preparations. "This is going to be risky," she said, her tone grave. "If the Krons have already infiltrated the facility, we'll be walking into the heart of their forces." Reynolds didn't flinch. "We've faced worse." Minutes later, the team descended into the belly of the CERN energy complex. The structure was vast, a monolithic array of shimmering towers and conduits, channels of light snaking through the corridors like veins of raw power. The air was thick with the hum of energy, and the walls vibrated with the potential for devastation. As they moved deeper into the heart of the facility, the team came upon a terrifying sight. Krons, more than a dozen, had already infiltrated the complex, their chidnous forms lurking in the shadows, setting traps and laying in wait. The CERN soldiers, despite their advanced knowledge of the terrain, were outmatched by the brutal, combat-hardened Krons. "We're not alone," one of the CERN soldiers whispered. "They're waiting for us." Reynolds drew his weapon. "Then let's give them a fight they'll remember." The firefight that followed was intense and fast. CERN energy weapons crackled, sending pulses of raw power into the Krons' ranks. The humans and CERN moved as one, clearing each room and corridor with precision. But the Krons, relentless as ever, didn't retreat. They pressed forward, fighting with savage coordination, determined to stop them at all costs. At the heart of the reactor, they finally found what they were looking for: a massive core, surrounded by Krons guarding the central controls. Reynolds and his team fought their way through the last of the opposition, barely pausing for breath, until they reached the terminal. Dr. Carter's hands flew over the console, her mind racing as she initiated the sequence to overload the reactor. "We've got one shot at this," she said, voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Prepare for a chain reaction in 3, 2. Before she could finish, the facility trembled and the lights flickered. A Krons warship loomed overhead, its massive form blocking out the sky. It was clear this would be no easy victory. "General," Dr. Carter gasped, "we've triggered something. The Krons are reacting." The countdown had begun, but so had the final desperate fight. The seconds seemed to stretch as the energy core of the CERN's reactor began to hum louder, its intensity rising with each passing moment. The countdown on Dr. Carter's console ticked down. Every muscle in Reynolds' body was tense as the Krons closed in. There was no turning back now. "We're running out of time." Admiral Foster's voice crackled over the comms, her voice full of urgency. "The Krons are bringing in reinforcements. If we don't finish this now, we'll be trapped." Reynolds looked around the chamber. The Exern soldiers who had accompanied them were holding the line, but even they couldn't hold out forever. The Krons were closing in from all directions. The team had made it this far, but now they were fighting a two-front battle. One against the Krons who wanted to stop them from completing the mission, and another against the ticking clock that threatened to wipe them all out. Dr. Carter's fingers hovered over the final sequence to overload the reactor. "It's not just about overloading the reactor anymore," she said through gritted teeth. "We need to set it off in a way that creates a chain reaction across their entire fleet. If we don't, this is all for nothing." Reynolds nodded sharply. "Do it." But before Carter could press the final command, the chamber doors slammed open with a deafening crash, and a wave of Krons poured into the room. Their chitinous armor gleamed menacingly, their weapons primed for slaughter. The air crackled with the anticipation of combat, and the stench of fear mixed with the metallic scent of energy. "We're running out of time," Reynolds shouted, drawing his sidearm and stepping into position. He aimed, firing in rapid succession, each shot taking down one of the Kron soldiers, but more seemed to take their place. His team was engaged in a brutal fight, CERN energy weapons firing with precision, but the Kron's sheer numbers were overwhelming. Admiral Foster, back-to-back with Reynolds, wielded a large plasma cannon, her face determined. "General, I'll hold them off. You finish this." Reynolds hesitated, but only for a moment. "No, we finish this together." He turned back to Dr. Carter. "You're not doing this alone. Let's get this done." Carter, her face pale from the stress, nodded and reached for the console once again. Her fingers danced over the holographic interface, inputting the final coordinates to trigger the catastrophic overload. As she initiated the sequence, an alarm blared across the chamber. "Warning. Core overload imminent. Reactor destabilization. 70 seconds to detonation. Move," Reynolds yelled, grabbing Carter's arm. He pulled her away from the console and toward the chamber's exit. The Exern soldiers fought with everything they had, pushing the Krons back, but the enemy wasn't retreating. Instead, they were closing in, trying to stop them from escaping the reactor's imminent explosion. The ground trembled as the countdown reached its final moments, and Reynolds could feel the air itself vibrating with the impending destruction. The first blast from the core surged outward, sending a shockwave through the chamber that threw Reynolds and his team off their feet. The Krons around them staggered, but they quickly recovered, their war-hardened instincts kicking in. "We're not going to make it," Dr. Carter screamed, her voice laced with panic. "We need to get out now." But Reynolds refused to yield. "Keep moving." He grabbed Carter's wrist and yanked her to her feet, then pushed toward the exit, firing back at the oncoming Krons. The walls of the facility were beginning to crack, the lights flickering as the reactor's energy surged out of control. They rounded a corner, and the exit came into view, a narrow corridor leading up to an emergency evacuation tunnel. But as they ran, a massive explosion rocked the facility, and the building seemed to collapse in on itself. The Krons, too, were not immune to the fallout. Their soldiers shrieked as the shockwave ripped through their ranks. "Go! Go!" Reynolds barked, his heart racing as he forced Carter forward. Foster and the rest of the team were close behind, but the destruction was spreading quickly. The facility was coming apart, piece by piece. A wall exploded to their left, sending debris flying in every direction. Reynolds instinctively shielded Carter with his body, taking the brunt of the impact as debris rained down on them. The air was thick with dust, and Reynolds could barely see through the smoke. His head rang from the explosion, and his vision blurred. "We're not going to make it," Foster shouted from behind them. "We have to," Reynolds growled. "Now move." He forced his way through the chaos, pushing Carter ahead. With every step, the ground beneath them quaked, and the noise of the reactor's impending explosion grew louder. Finally, they reached the evacuation tunnel, just as the facility was about to collapse entirely. The last thing Reynolds heard before the world went black was the sound of the Kron's final desperate assault, and the deafening roar of the chain reaction he had set in motion. The world was a blur when Reynolds came to. His body ached from the impact, his mind struggling to process the chaos around him. For a moment, he couldn't tell where he was. His vision swam in and out of focus as he slowly became aware of the harsh, acrid smell of smoke and burning metal. The air was thick with dust, and every breath felt like inhaling ash. "General, are you awake?" Admiral Foster's voice broke through the haze. Reynolds blinked rapidly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He was on the floor of a makeshift shelter, his side pressed against the cool metal of a fallen beam. Foster knelt beside him, her face ashen but determined. Her uniform was singed in places, but she was alive. That was all that mattered. "I'm fine," Reynolds muttered, struggling to sit up. He winced as pain shot through his ribs. "What happened? Where's Dr. Carter?" "She's here," Foster replied, glancing over her shoulder. Dr. Carter was kneeling on the other side of the room, her fingers working quickly over a portable datapad. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, but she looked unharmed. "We made it out. But the reactor—" "It worked," Reynolds interrupted, pushing himself up. The walls of the shelter were trembling with the distant rumble of the fallout from the explosion. It was impossible to see if the full extent of the chain reaction had reached its target, but they'd set the Kron's fleet on a collision course with their own destruction. "We didn't just disable their fleet," Dr. Carter said quietly, her voice betraying the gravity of what had occurred. The energy core's overload triggered a systemic collapse across their entire war network. Every Kron ship, every command center, they're all affected. Reynolds nodded, his eyes narrowing. "So we've crippled them." "For now," Dr. Carter replied, her voice heavy. "But it's not permanent. The Krons are relentless. They'll adapt." Foster's expression was grim. "We've bought ourselves time, but we still have a long way to go. The Krons won't stay down forever." Reynolds stood, ignoring the sharp pain in his side. He took a moment to steady himself, then walked over to the shelter's viewport. Through the cracked window, he could see the dark remnants of the Kron's fleet scattered across the sky. Some ships were adrift, their lights flickering, while others were burning in the atmosphere, flames licking at their hulls. "We've got a chance," Reynolds said, his voice low but resolute. "But we can't afford to sit back and hope they don't recover. We need to press our advantage." "We'll need a plan," Foster said. "Our forces are spread thin, and we don't have enough firepower to defeat them outright. But if we can strike at their core, where they control the remaining fleet—" Reynolds turned, his eyes locking onto Foster's. "Then we go after their heart." The team regrouped in the shelter, the sound of distant explosions shaking the walls. It was clear that the Krons weren't finished yet. Their response would be swift, but with the strategic edge they had gained, humanity had the chance to finish what they had started. "Let's move," Reynolds said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We're not out of this yet, but we will be. It's time to end this war." As they made their way toward the command center, Reynolds couldn't help but think of the cost of victory. Too many had already fallen. The Xern, though grateful, had lost everything. Nearly their entire world lay in ruins. Humanity had thrown itself into this fight without hesitation, and now they would face the consequences of their choices. But there was no turning back. The Krons had underestimated Earth, and it would be their downfall. The battle was far from over, but one thing was certain: humanity would fight to the last. The walls of the Xern stronghold trembled as Reynolds and his team made their way toward the heart of the enemy's command center. Every step they took echoed in the silence that had settled after the chaos of the past hours. The battle was far from over, but the tide had shifted. The Krons, though formidable and relentless, were now on the defensive. The explosion of their own reactor had shattered their coordination, leaving their forces scattered and vulnerable. "We're getting close," Foster said, her voice steady despite the tension that hung in the air. "The Kron's central control hub is just ahead. If we can take it out, we can cripple their command network for good." Reynolds nodded, his mind focused on the task at hand. "We don't have much time. Their remaining forces will regroup soon, and if they manage to bring their command structure back online, we'll be back at square one." Dr. Carter, who had been silent up until that point, glanced at Reynolds. "The Krons aren't just a military threat. Their hive mind is tied directly to that command hub. If we destroy it, their entire system of communication and strategy will collapse. The rest of their forces will become nothing more than disorganized fighters, easily picked off. But if we fail," Reynolds said, trailing off. The stakes were clear. One misstep could mean the Krons would adapt, recover, and become an even bigger threat than before. They had to succeed. The hallway ahead was lined with blast doors and shields, evidence of the Krons' attempts to fortify their last stand. Reynolds motioned for the team to move swiftly but cautiously, their footsteps barely making a sound as they approached the heart of the Kron's stronghold. As they neared the central hub, the dim lighting flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The hum of the enemy's machinery was deafening, and the faint vibrations in the floor signaled that they were very close. Reynolds held up a hand, signaling for the team to stop. "Stay sharp," he whispered. "We're in their territory now." The doors to the command center loomed ahead, massive and fortified. With no time to waste, Reynolds approached the controls, using the access codes Dr. Carter had gathered from their earlier infiltration. The door opened with a hiss, revealing a large chamber filled with Kron's war data, communication consoles, and holographic maps of the galaxy. It was a place of strategy, the nerve center of their war effort. A dozen Krons stood in the center, their bodies towering over the consoles, their sharp mandibles clicking as they turned to face the intruders. They'd been waiting for them. "General, this is it," Dr. Carter said, her voice tight with anticipation. "If we destroy the central processor now, the Krons will have no way to coordinate their forces." Reynolds gave a sharp nod. "Do it." Dr. Carter approached a terminal, her fingers flying over the controls. "I'm initiating the overload sequence. Get ready." Suddenly, the air crackled as the Krons surged forward, weapons raised. The battle erupted in an instant, blinding flashes of light, the sound of plasma fire filling the air. Reynolds ducked behind a console, his weapon already in hand, firing with deadly accuracy. The Exern soldiers, though outnumbered, fought with a fury that matched the Kron's own savagery. Foster, with her plasma cannon, took out 2 Krons in quick succession, clearing a path for Dr. Carter. The technician worked furiously, her face illuminated by the glow of the terminal as she bypassed Kron's security protocols. 5 seconds, Dr. Carter shouted. "Stay low." Reynolds took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The Krons were closing in, but the team was relentless. They had made it this far. They couldn't falter now. "Time's up," Dr. Carter yelled, slamming her hand onto the final key. The reactor at the center of the command hub sputtered to life, sending a shockwave through the chamber. Sparks flew as the central processor began to overload. The Krons shrieked, realizing too late what had just happened. "No," one of the Krons roared, charging forward, but it was too late. The terminal exploded in a burst of energy, engulfing the chamber in a blinding light. The explosion sent the Krons flying, their bodies crashing against the walls as the entire facility began to shake. The central command hub crumbled as the overload rippled outward, sending shockwaves through the Krons' fleet and communications network. The room was plunged into chaos as the lights flickered, and the walls buckled under the pressure. Reynolds was thrown back by the force of the blast, but quickly regained his footing. His ears were ringing, but the only thing that mattered was the sound of the Krons' screams and the shattering of their once dominant war network. "We've done it," Foster said, her voice heavy with disbelief. "They're finished." Dr. Carter, breathless, looked at the smoldering remains of the Kron's control center. "It's over. Their hive mind is broken. Their command structure is in ruins." Reynolds took a moment to absorb the magnitude of the victory. The Kron's threat had been silenced, their grip on the galaxy shattered. Humanity had answered the call, not just for survival, but for the chance to change the course of history. As the dust settled, Reynolds turned toward his team, a rare smile crossing his face. "We did it. We won." It was a hard-earned victory, but humanity had proven its worth to the galaxy. And in doing so, they had taken their place as a force to be reckoned with.